Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Back in Wisconsin, on solid ground. We're not in the van rolling.
It does feel good to be back in lovely Wisconsin in March. Spring has sprung. It's a little warmer outside, and that's exciting.
Indeed. Yes, that's always one of the exciting things about getting back from the Austin South by Southwest trip is by the time we get home, usually
it's warm again.
Springtime, yeah.
So it's like one last hurrah, like winter usually gets you in the face one last time, like a little quick slap.
Oh, I'm waiting for it.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
There will be one more snowstorm before this winter ends, but that's okay.
Yeah.
We're ready for it. We got a new van that's ready to plow through.
Woohoo!
And it's blue like the Mystery Machine too. So we're going to take it to play music and solve mysteries all around North
Can't
America
wait.
Is the plan.
Or explore mysteries.
Yeah.
Mysteries of the paranormal nature.
We're going to roll Big Blue through your town coming up soon. I hope so.
Me too.
You know, speaking of Texas, Wendy.
Yeah?
This guest coming up lives in Dallas.
Oh, we could have dropped in and said hello.
And that's what I was
through.
That's what I was thinking of. I was totally thinking that we should probably drop by his place. It's like, oh, we could have just stopped by there on Tuesday night. That'd have been great. But he was supposed to be at the Paradigm Symposium that we attended in May.
Ah, yes. Loved that event.
He was one of the, he's going to be one of the speakers. His name is Nick Redfern, and he is a British author, lives in Texas. And he's covered every single kind of paranormal phenomena that you can imagine.
I know you're a big fan, Mike, because you've told me about him many times in the past, actually, long before this interview was set up and before the Paradigm event.
Well, and one of the reasons that I love talking about him is because in his autobiographical works, he sneaks in like references to punk rock music all the time.
Awesome.
So he's always got some good reference to punk rock or party, and like he's you know, he's into the same kind of things we are, so that's why I always appreciate reading his works. And getting him on the show is great. It was one of the highlights, I think, so far. And I think people who hear this interview are going to agree.
Well, I can't wait any longer. Let's get down to it.
All right. Well, what are you doing? Press play. Nick Redfern is the author of 40 books on ufology, cryptozoology, secret societies, conspiracies, and the paranormal. An incredibly prolific researcher and author, Nick usually contributes about 2 books a year to the field. We love Forteana and all manner of unusual topics, so we are thrilled to welcome Nick to the podcast. Me and Allison want to thank you very much for joining us today, Nick.
Oh, thanks, guys. Thanks a lot.
And where are you talking to us today from?
From Arlington, Texas, which is where I live. It's about 25 miles, 20 miles outside of Dallas.
Okay, and so for anybody who's listening and they're like, okay, I hear an English accent coming from a guy from Texas, how did you wind up near the Big D?
Well, I actually got a job offer. I've been here about 17 years, and it was working for a publishing company putting books out, and I was doing sort of editing and research for them. And it was going to be like a 2-year-long job altogether. And so I thought, I didn't have any ties in the UK. I thought that'd be kind of cool, and so I came over and liked it, and then did all the whole immigration thing, and went through that process. And so yeah, I've been here sort of about 17 years, and a lot of the work was based out of the Dallas area, so it made sense to be there, or here, and so yeah, I like it around here. It's sort of there's plenty to do, and good sort of nightlife and restaurants and all sorts of stuff, So.
Well, we're happy to have you here. You definitely increased our cool factor in the U.S., and we need help in that area very sorely right now.
Allison does need a lot of help in that area. No, but what I was going to say was, growing up in the UK and then coming to the United States, number one, I'm interested in how you got into the paranormal and Forteana in the first place. And then also, have you noticed different attitudes or, what's the difference between, you'd say, maybe American Forteana and UK weird stuff?
I think that's a good question. I think probably the biggest difference is the fact that because, the US is a relatively new nation, going back several hundred years. I think the big difference is in the UK, there's still a lot of interest and research done into sort of, events that occurred 800-900 years ago, like haunted castles and ghostly tales and, legends of stone circles and all that kind of thing. So I think that's probably the biggest difference is the period of time that gets covered, in terms of 14 research. But that's just due to the ages in the different ages in relation to the two countries. But I think in terms of what actually gets investigated, it really isn't that much different. UFOs, lake monsters, strange creatures, ghosts. It's pretty much the same kind of things, really. But as far as how I got interested in all this, when I was about 5 or 6, my parents took me on a week's vacation to Scotland, and we spent a day at Loch Ness. And my dad told me the story of the Loch Ness Monster, and as we sort of stood on the shore, and as a little kid, that sort of got me all excited and fired up, and then as I got a bit older, I started reading books by people like John Keel, and Brad Steiger and people like that, and really that got me interested in the paranormal. But and then when I finished school, I began working on a magazine in England called Zero, which is like an entertainment magazine for teenagers, and I enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed sort of writing, and it didn't seem like a real job, and I didn't have to wear a shirt and a suit or anything like that,
Right.
And which I hate doing. And then after a while, I thought, well, why not combine the two? The interest in the paranormal with the ties with the UFO subject, etc. So that's really what sort of got me involved in it all.
So it was Nessie at the start, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to you because, Mike and I, we're very into historical research, and we have haunted history tours that we do in our local area. And I've just always been enamored of your level of research that you do. Sometimes there are such extraordinary things, that you are able to uncover from documents that you find through your research. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. Like, how do you find sources? And in terms of your finds, what have been the most surprising things to you as a researcher that you've been able to uncover?
Well, in terms of how I sort of uncover things, it's sort of two ways. One would be, just I pick up on a story, or, there's a breaking news story, and I think it's something that's worth looking into. So I'll sort of, they'll go looking for the answers. But in the same way that, if it was a journalist working for a local newspaper investigating, a local murder or something like that. You follow the threads and the leads of the story. But what very often happens, and this happens more than that approach, is that when you write books and articles and things like that, and people read them, if they've had their own experiences, then they tend to contact you. For example, I've done 3 books on the Men in Black mystery, and so for people who've read the books and had their own experiences, I get a lot of people write to me about their encounters with the Men in Black, and then, if it's a really cool story, I'll ask them, is it okay, if I do a more in-depth interview with you, and would you mind, if I use it in the next book? And, and so that is very often the way that I get onto a story, is because people approach me after having read the books. Now, as far as the whole issue of sort of the more surprising and weirder things I've found out, I guess more than anything else, it's this issue of how government agencies get involved in a lot of weird stuff. Everybody knows that various governments around the world have investigated the UFO phenomenon over the years. But through the Freedom of Information Act, I mean, I found files on all sorts of really weird stuff, like how in the 50s the US Army tried to figure out if dogs possessed ESP, because if they did, they wanted to train the dogs to try and psychically find minefields or mines on battlefields, that kind of thing. If they were buried deep down, they were trying to figure out if the dogs could actually psychically find the mines. And in the Second World War, I got hold of a bunch of files which were showing how the British police force was secretly using dowsers to try and find the dead bodies of people who had been killed in attacks by the Nazis. When the Germans were flying over and bombing the cities, and people were buried under the rubble, whether dead or alive, that the police secretly brought in dowsers to try and find people buried under the wreckage. So that's one of the things that sort of really kind of surprised me, was the sheer extent of a lot of the strange research that government agencies get involved in.
I want to know about the dowsers, if they found anything.
You want to know about the dowsers, did you say?
Yeah, did they have any results from the dowsers where they're like, well, the dowsers actually did find a bunch of bodies underneath the rubble?
Oh, yeah, well, that's one of the interesting things about it, is that they actually did find bodies, and that's, why the file is quite an extensive one. It talks about how a number of police officers, for example, actually also had these skills. It wasn't just a case that the police were looking out for dowsers. When the program was put into place, a couple of officers came forward and said, well, I can douse. You don't need to go and find them. And one of them was a P.C. Terry. That was his last name, Terry. And he proved to be extremely good at finding bodies. And much of the one particular file that's been declassified talks about how the successes he had finding these bodies. And because of the time frame back then, there was a great deal of debate within the file as to whether or not this should be actually done, even if it was successful. And the reason was that, well, if it got out to the general public and the media, would they think that the police were sort of dabbling in witchcraft, and things like that? That's the way they looked at it. It was, yes, it was successful, but they were worried about how the public would perceive the police, thinking that they were involved in all sorts of occult practices or whatever. So, right. It tells you as much about, so the prejudices of society in relation to, the unexplained back then versus how today, now and again, the police force, do bring in psychics to try and help, with crime cases when they've sort of given up on every other avenue.
And what surprises me about that is just dowsing in general, that they'd pick that particular kind of thing that always seems like the biggest kind of hocus pocus in the first place. and the fact that P.C. Terry was good at it. Oh yeah, we'll send Terry out there. He's a brilliant dowser. And I find that remarkable. And the funny thing is, if that's what they declassified, what's the stuff they're keeping?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's one of the things we don't know. I mean, for all the really weird and interesting files that have surfaced, we don't know how many remain, behind closed doors. I mean, to give you a few other examples, there's a British government crop circle file where British pilots and American pilots flying over Europe to attack Germany had seen these huge formations on the ground in the fields, and they thought they were like coded messages left for German pilots. It was like a code that would mean like bomb London at midnight, approach from the east, or something like that. But it turns out that when the certain German pilots were being captured, they admitted they'd seen these formations, and they thought they were made by the Brits. So and nobody really knew who made them. So this is like an early crop circle file.
Wow.
And, there are files on witchcraft. There's like I wouldn't say well-known, but sort of, it's in the public domain, a file about how the US military was using sort of psychological warfare on the enemy in Vietnam and exploiting the the belief systems, the supernatural belief systems of the North Vietnamese. So they would spread stories about some of these monstrous creatures that lived in the jungles of North Vietnam as a means to frighten the North Vietnamese troops. And it actually worked, So sometimes, you can, the government files talk about genuine unknown phenomena like dowsing or unexplained phenomena, but sometimes they would create real-life monsters and mysteries as a means to frighten the enemy. But, there was actually no real monster or creature there, but it actually worked. The process actually worked of frightening the enemy and getting them to leave one specific area. So.
Well, when you said the witchcraft thing, I thought you were going to have a Bewitched was a CIA disinformation plot, and I'm like, no. I knew there was something spooky about those two different Darrens.
That's right. Something's not right there. Well, Nick, what I wanted to ask is, I know in my own historical research that, you just get to the point as a researcher, as a paranormal investigator, where you think certain things are bunk, like crop circles, for example. And then, you find an old file that, it's before it became popular, before it became such a big thing in the collective consciousness, that they showed up in a way that was corroborated by even enemy forces. So, I mean, that's crazy when that happens. And that's happened to me too, where you're like, this is bunk. And then you find an article where it's not connected to anything, or, some kind of document which really kind of tells you the rest of the story. And then you're like, whoa, I thought I didn't think there was anything to this, and now I have to reassess. Have you come to that point in your research sometimes where you just thought you had something sorted, and then, a spanner gets thrown into the works because you find some documentation or articles that make you change your mind?
Well, yeah, certainly the crop circle one is a classic example because, even the term crop circle wasn't created until sort of the late 1980s, and people assumed it was a modern-day phenomenon. But reading these files, regardless of whether people think crop circles are a real unexplained phenomenon or they think it's just a bunch of guys running around, stomping the corn down in the middle of the night, regardless of what views people have, these files are important because they show it's actually not a new phenomenon. And it also shows that, these things were being seen in the 40s, not just in the UK, but in mainland Europe when the pilots were flying, towards Germany. So again, you have to sort of reapproach the phenomenon, really to show that, hey, this isn't just a modern-day issue, regardless of what your views are. But I do find that quite often. Sort of going back to the Men in Black cases, for the most part, the Men in Black mystery kicked off in the early 1950s, and there were a few sporadic cases in the late 40s. But over the years, I've got a lot of stories where people had encounters clearly with the Men in Black, but they went back to sort of like the 1920s, and I've even got some reports from the 1800s and 1700s that people sent me from old manuscripts written back then, and they're clearly describing pretty much the same as what people are describing today with the Men in Black. So again, that forces you to sort of reassess when the phenomenon really kicked in, and were they around before the UFO issue was around even. So, it sort of pushes the barriers back, but it also makes you realize that we're not seeing the full picture of a lot of these phenomena. They seem to expand in time, but certainly further backwards. And, some of the ideas that this is just hoaxing, you have to then sort of throw that sort of scenario out the window, really.
Well, wouldn't that be great to see a steampunk Men in Black?
Well, yeah. that would actually surprise me.
Well, what you're saying is like the Holy Grail to me. When you're researching something and you find articles from history that everybody has forgotten about, and it's talking about something that is still present today. That's a kind of proof to me that there's something authentic to the phenomena. If it's going on today and it was going on before in much the same way. And you know that as Western culture, at least, well, I know American culture for sure, as we touched on earlier, does not have a very long memory for history. So, and if you can find stuff back in the historical record that supports, that a phenomenon was going on just as the way it is now, I mean, really, to me, that's something that can make you believe.
Yeah, and I think that's an important issue, and it also impacts on our beliefs, our prejudices, our ideas and thoughts, and but I do find it interesting when people say, "Oh, well, there's no such thing as the paranormal," but you can find in two very different countries, the UK and the US, you can find a lot of the same phenomena. So, in other words, if this was just down to legend and mythology and campfire tales, I think we would see a huge difference between the phenomena reported here and the reported in the UK, because the cultures are so different. But we actually see near identical things. So in other words, I think that's a good pointer that we're dealing with real phenomena, whether it's the men in black or it's strange creatures like lake monsters and ghostly phenomena. When you see this all around the world, I think that's sort of a pointer in the direction that whatever these things are, they are valid and real.
And we've had a lot of shows on that recently on cross-cultural aspects, and that as a form of possibly some proof as well. Yeah, just the last few shows that we've had, we've been talking a lot about like the little people, for example, and going into one of your most recent books, 365 Days of UFOs. I was looking for local connections in there, and you had one from December 24th, 1971. Hey, Mike, it was in Trempealeau. So it's Trempealeau Mountain, Wisconsin, which is, I don't think it's official. It's not officially a mountain. It's only 425 feet tall, but it's a mountain to us. So anyway, up in that nature area, a man named Frank Banner was walking his dog, and he ran across 15 little people dressed in what he described as primitive clothing. And he took them to be aliens. But I wanted to hear, if you recall anything from that. That seems to have ties cross-culturally.
Yeah, well, these sort of stories, I've actually got a lot of accounts of people seeing like little humanoid creatures in the woods and so on. And although in some cases, people do perceive these as aliens, I mean, there is this intriguing theory that, could there be sort of hidden offshoots of the human race, that we're Homo sapien, and before us there was like Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal, and so the theory is, could there be other types of primitive human that perhaps coexist with us in a very stealthy way, and to the point where we don't know about them and just they're occasionally seen? I mean, for example, you might remember like about 10 years or so ago, the story surfaced out of, like, for example, Sumatra, stories of the so-called hobbit. There's like this very primitive small humanoid about 3 feet tall, which was far more human-like than ape-like. And people still see strange creatures around that area today. Today it's called the Orang Pendek, and it's described as like a small humanoid ape-like animal that walks upright. And some people think it is far more human than ape-like, period. So, I sometimes wonder, with some of these cases coming out of like Trempealeau Mountain and so on, that are we actually dealing, with an indigenous race that has hidden from us and stayed away from us for as long as it's been around, and occasionally gets seen.
Well, I used to live in that area of the state, and I'd say it's probably inbreds.
Mike.
It's the hills have eyes up in Trempealeau Mountain.
I've actually been to Trempealeau Mountain. I did an episode of Monster Quest there about 7 or 8 years ago, and I think you can probably find it on YouTube. But we went out there because there've been reports of like giant birds and things like that out there, and I remember it was like boiling hot, and we had to climb the mountain. I thought I was going to die by the time I got to the top. because we were carrying backpacks and all sorts. But no, it was a cool sort of fun expedition. But a friend of mine, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, Mac Tonis, he wrote a book called The Crypto-Terrestrials, and it's only a small book because he died before he was able to finish it all, but the editor was able to put together, a good manuscript. And basically, his book, The Crypto-Terrestrials, deals with this idea of like secret or hidden indigenous races that are related to the human race coexisting with us. And he talks about people who he spoke to who'd seen sort of these little primitive humanoid entities in the woods, in some of the massive woods and forests, where hardly anybody ever goes. And I guess the closest analogy I can think of in the world of fiction, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Darkness, about a bunch of girls, they're cavers, they enter this cave system in this forested part of the US, and they get attacked by these small humanoids that live deep underground, and they're responsible for a lot of the people who go missing every year. So it's basically dinner.
The Neil Marshall movie, right? That's
yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic film. We'll put a link to that in the show notes because it's that's a good one that it doesn't even feel like a horror movie until you get to the middle of it, and then all of a sudden the pants wedding begins all at once.
That sounds like something to look up on Netflix tonight.
Yeah.
Well, there's actually a follow-on which really isn't good at all, which often happens, with the sequel. It's not as good, but if you get to see the first one, if you haven't seen it, it's a really good movie. It's quite thought-provoking, in the sense that you can find all around the world stories of little people that coexist with us, and they can be friendly or dangerous or helpful or violent. And I mean, people think of fairies, they think of like Tinkerbell and little figures flitting around the Christmas tree or whatever, But if you go back and look at the original stories of fairies in the UK, say 500 or 600 years ago, they were quite sort of ominous creatures. They were described as like 3 to 4 feet tall or 2 feet tall. They would typically come out at night, and they would live in the underground areas, in these mounds and tunnels, and they would steal babies and all sorts of weird stuff like this. And when you look at that, and then you've got things like goblins, and I think although we look at these phenomena today more from a perspective of either very skeptical or it's just a bit of fun, for the kids, that kind of thing. But I often think that where you have legends, very often they're based on a reality, even if it's a distorted reality. So, I think the original fairies today have been mutated, like I said, into Tinkerbell type characters. But back then, they were as sort of feared as much as they were respected, and they were like little sort of ugly looking, wizened, creepy little humanoids that would come out the ground. So, you have to wonder if there is a reality to it, that something semi-human does coexist with us,
Well, fairies seem to be coming up all the time lately in our conversations, which is funny. It is like, well, about the fairies. It's like, yep. But it's
I think that might be my fault.
But it's funny. Grimm's fairy tales, though. I mean, the same kind of thing. You think of Grimm's fairy tales started out as much darker stories and then evolved to be, Beauty and the Beast, like this, or Cinderella, or these wonderful, or Snow White. Like Snow White doesn't get put to death at the end of the Disney version.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, another good example would be if you look at things like sea serpents. Now, probably the most famous sea monster would be something like the Kraken, but that was like allegedly like this gigantic thing, sort of 10 times the size of Godzilla or whatever. And so I don't think the Kraken really was a genuine animal. But what I do think is that people may well have seen things like sea serpents, which I think, are a reality. And over time it became distorted into where, a 30 or 40 foot long sea serpent type creature was seen, and then over time the legend grows and grows to where the point where it was like a fire-breathing creature of 300 feet long or whatever, So I think, again, it's important not to dismiss folk tales and mythology, because very often they do have a reality their basis or at the core of it, but it's just been changed over time. It's like human nature. It's like the guy who, is out fishing and bags a 2-foot salmon. He swears it's 3 foot long. You know what I mean? That kind of thing.
Well, I was wondering, Nick, we should talk about your new books really quick. But before we get to that, in your, as long as we're talking about the wide-ranging breadth of your research, what do you think is the biggest surprise that you came into something thinking, okay, I'm just looking over this as an obligation. I think it's completely way out there and I don't believe it at all. And then you came away thinking, there's something to this that I wasn't quite, that now I am interested in it.
Okay. Well, yeah, I can tell you what that definitely is. That would be the Puerto Rican Chupacabra. I wrote a book 2 years ago called Chupacabra Road Trip, which is all about my expeditions to Puerto Rico and road trips to Puerto Rico and around the U.S. looking for the Chupacabra. Now, when the mystery first surfaced out of Puerto Rico in the mid-90s, there were a lot of stories and friend of a friend accounts and a lot of sort of hysteria and, over-the-top excitement about this. And although I was fascinated by it, I followed the stories, it was still one of these things where, it's a long way away, I'm not able to get there, and some of the stories were friend of a friend cases. But over the course of the last, the first time I went to Puerto Rico was 2004, and the most recent time was 2014, and I've been there many times now, and collectively for probably several months altogether. And what sort of really surprised me was the sheer highly credible body of reports, and how the story or the phenomenon is taken extremely seriously. I spoke to veterinarians, police officers, ranchers, members of the public, all of who'd had their own experiences and, described this creature as very similar, like a humanoid type creature about the size of a chimpanzee, but completely hairless and with these glowing red eyes and with like a row of spikes down its head and neck, like a punk rock mohawk, but made of spikes. And a lot of people reported the creatures having these bat-like wings, and describing a very ominous-looking creature. But the people relating the accounts were highly credible. And, when you sort of spend time with the people and getting to know them and gaining their trust, that they gain your trust, and they realize you're not going to poke fun and you're being respectful, then they open up. And I've got, a bunch of really good, highly credible cases from Puerto Rico of whatever this thing is. I mean, it kind of sounds like the closest thing you could imagine to a cross between the Mothman and a gargoyle. That's probably the best way I can describe how they look. So going to Puerto Rico, in person, spending a lot of time there, really did open my eyes to the not just the reality of the phenomenon, but the seriousness of it, and also the widespread nature of it all across the island of Puerto Rico. And of course, they make good margaritas there as well. So.
Well, the thing about the Chupacabra, I always think it's a funny idea, because they had all of those the bombing ranges and the so they have all of that strange ammunition, and like on Vieques, there's still lots of unexploded ammunition and bombs and stuff, and there's parts of the island you can't go to, and you're just thinking, did all of those things and depleted uranium and everything, get into the water and create some kind of mutant punk rock creature?
Yeah, well, that is one of the theories that's been put forward. The idea that it could be like a mutant type creature. A lot of people don't realize, given the fact that it's like a huge jungle type environment, there actually aren't any large indigenous animals on Puerto Rico. Anything of any size has been imported, and we're just talking about like pigs, cows, goats, that kind of horses, that kind of thing. Other than that, there's just just very small animals, rats, rodents, things like that, and obviously a lot of lizards and reptiles, those kinds of things. So whatever these creatures are, in some fashion, either they were mutated on the island or somehow they were brought here, but they, obviously don't seem to be indigenous because people weren't reporting them hundreds of years ago. But, there has been some weird stuff going on the island. I mean, for example, there's a small island just off the coast of the main island of Puerto Rico where for years they've done research into primates, into apes, and also into monkeys. And it's like an experimental lab area where they've done research into what's called SIV, which is the simian version of HIV in people. Okay. And the research has been done to try and figure out ways to completely cure AIDS. And but yeah, there's been a lot of military programs on Puerto Rico as well, and also stories of contaminants getting into the water supply. That's actually something I talk about in the book as well, as to how that might have some sort of role in it. Now, one of the reasons why I think that could be the case is that, about a decade or so or thereabouts ago, we had the stories of the so-called Chupacabra coming to the United States, and specifically here in the US. Now, if you look up Texas Chupacabra, you'll see a creature that looks nothing like the Puerto Rican one, which is, like I said, like a bipedal winged animal. I'm sure you've seen these pictures, these sort of hairless, dog-like animals. It's
like a mangy mutt.
Yeah. Now, although the skeptics say, well, they're just coyotes with mange, they're actually not. There is more to it than that. Now, they're not an unknown species because we actually have the bodies of a number of them which have been autopsied, and they clearly are coyote DNA, sometimes mixed with wild wolves, sometimes mixed with dogs, but for the most part, the overriding DNA is coyote. But most of these animals that have been photographed and killed, they're completely hairless. Now, mange is a condition caused by a mite, which typically has the animals, just scratching themselves and biting themselves because they're just crazy, because they're itching so much, and the scratching causes infections, and they very often die. And
that makes me feel bad.
Yeah, it is a bad.
Yeah,
if you look into it, it's not happy. It's fatal.
No, it's not. It's not a nice condition, but the hair is quite patchy. But with these animals, they're like 100% hairless. There's no evidence of the scratching and the itching. It's like they're developing in a hairless way. Now, on
You'd
top
think
of
that'd
that,
be a Brazilian phenomena.
Oh, Mike.
yeah, good one. And
just ignore him.
Also, no, I got it. That was a good one, actually. But there are other issues as well. Like, for example, they have this overextended overbite. Their jaws should be uniform, but they're not. And also, they have this sort of weird hopping movement. Their front limbs are sort of growing at a shorter level, so they kind of have this hopping movement like a kangaroo. And there's like a psychological aspect as well, is that most coyotes, if they're around people, though they see people, they run away, and they typically come out and hunt at night. These creatures, one of the reasons why ranchers have been able to kill them or shoot them, or why they've been hit by vehicles, is because they very often are seen hunting in the day, and they're not frightened of people. For example, I've got one really sort of creepy case where a rancher's farm animals were being attacked, and he went out in his truck. This was a Texas case, and he was, like a big sort of burly, macho Texas rancher, with his truck and his guns and everything else. And he went out and saw one of these animals, got out his truck, was about to shoot it, and he kind of had that feeling that we all have from time to time, that you're being watched. And he looked over his right shoulder, and there was another one about 150 feet away, 100 feet away. And then to the left of him, there was another. And he felt, with hindsight, the three of them were like triangulating him, and they were slowly getting closer. And for all of his, his guns and everything else, he jumped back in that truck and headed straight back to his ranch and close the door. But he felt that, they were sort of targeting him and, closing in, which is unheard of. Coyotes just don't do that with people.
It's like the raptors in Jurassic Park.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what's interesting is a good friend of mine, Ken Gerhard. Ken lives down in San Antonio, and Ken has done a lot of research in the area. And one of the things that he's found is that where we have clusters of these strange coyotes is an area areas where you have coal burning plants. Now, one of the offshoots of coal burning plants is that they provoke into the atmosphere what's called sulfur dioxide. Now, sulfur dioxide is what's known as a mutagen. Now, a mutagen is something that can affect an animal at a DNA level. It's probably the worst mutagen of all is mercury. If, like, a pregnant woman gets, not that it would hardly ever happen, but if a pregnant woman got mercury inside her body, it can cause massive deformities to the growing fetus. And so, in other words, any kind of mutagen can have an effect on the human body and on animals as well. Now, of course, most people don't go around drinking mercury, and I wouldn't recommend it. But with sulfur dioxide, that gets into the air, so you're breathing it in. It's like with an atomic bomb with radiation. You have no way to avoid it because it's not a physical thing. It's just something you're breathing in. And that's the same with sulfur dioxide. And Ken has concluded that what's happening is that the reason why we get so many of these so-called Texas chupacabras around these plants is because they're being affected by sulfur dioxide, and the mutagen aspect is now creating almost like a new breed of coyote. And in other words, it's our contamination is actually changing the species.
That's absolutely fascinating. Like, number one, I didn't know we were going to talk about the Chupacabra for 10 minutes. So the fact that that's your big surprise is a huge surprise to me. So that was really exciting.
Well, that's good.
And so you just have a couple of new books out. And
it's hard to keep track of all of them, but
I was gonna
we managed.
It is to me, actually, as well.
So your latest book, is that the UFO one, or is that the one on secret societies?
Well, they'd pretty much come out at the same time, and it wasn't the case that I'd sort of feverishly been burning the candle at both ends, for weeks or months at a time. What often happens is that because I'm with 4 or 5 different publishers, one book might be, the writing might be finished a year ago, but the way one publisher might work is that they only put out one book from me per year. Another one might put one out every 6 months. So occasionally I'll have 2 out at the same time where it looks like I've been writing them at the same time, but actually haven't. It's just the publisher's schedule. So they're both brand new books, but the Secret Societies one was actually finished long before the 365 Days of UFOs. But they're both out together, and the Secret Societies one is like a 200 entries, 400-page long study of secret societies throughout history. Now, of course, I've included the well-known ones like the Masons and the Illuminati and things like that. But what I wanted to do was, demonstrate to people there's a lot of really fascinating cults and secret societies that most people probably have never heard of. I mean, a good example, and a very weird example, is one of the entries in the book, which is called the Loch Ness Dragon Cult. Now, back in the late 1960s, a number of American tourists, 3 American tourists, paid a visit to Loch Ness, and they weren't really that interested in the Loch Ness Monster. They were there to see a place called Boleskine House, which burned down 2 years ago. But Boleskine House, in the early part of the 20th century, was owned by Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist, and they wanted to see his house. Now, it turns out while they were there, they had to walk around. There's an old cemetery next to the house, and they found this strange, it was like a patchwork, almost like a sheet, but it was actually had all these designs of serpents on there and strange writing, all written in what turned out to be Turkish. And this particular sort of parchment, if you like, was shown to a Loch Ness monster researcher who was in the air at the time named Ted Holliday. And Ted Holliday dug into this further and found that this parchment was actually talking about how it was essentially like instructions for rites and rituals to try and conjure up a Babylonian sea goddess, a snake serpent named Tiamat, that, you know, was like a multi-thousand years old ancient Babylonian deity, if you like, but a highly dangerous one, this sort of like a cross between a woman and this serpent-like creature. And the more
I think I dated her.
We've all dated girls like that occasionally. And what happened was that Ted Holliday found that the more he dug into it, that this snake serpent cult, worshipping cult, was still active in and around the Loch Ness area. And he uncovered a number of disturbing stories about human sacrifice in the area. Now, I should stress these stories weren't confirmed, but he came to believe that, again, like with the stories of the little people we talked about earlier, he came to believe that, you know, some of the people who'd vanished in and around Scotland may have sort of fallen victim to this Babylonian snake goddess cult that existed somewhere in and around Loch Ness. So, in other words, with the book, I've tried to go with sort of really interesting and intriguing stories relating to cults and secret societies that most people have probably never heard of, but which are, in many respects, far more interesting than just, you know, talking about the Illuminati over and over again, you know.
Wow, that was a good one. Yeah, I didn't think Tiamat was going to come up.
Yeah, Tiamat always comes up.
Yeah, when you're least expecting her. But Aleister Crowley, the Aleister Crowley connection is great. Holy moly, it's Aleister Crowley. Uncle Al.
We call him Uncle Al on the show.
Our good old Uncle Al.
But, you know, there's a lot of weird cults out there. You know, most of them, you know, the whole inspiration is sort of power, money, influence, sex. You know, it's like those four are the four main areas that, you know, people sort of gravitate towards secret societies, and you can find them all around the world, you know, and it's, when you start looking into these things, it's like a, you know, fascinating secret world that most people never find out about, and, you know, don't even know about, and the more you look into it, the more you see that the world around us isn't necessarily what it appears to be. I mean, another good example, one from the US, there's an entry in the book called the Sons of Satan. Now, the Sons of Satan was a group that actually surfaced in the 1970s, and they claimed that they were behind at least some of the cattle mutilations that were occurring in the Southwest on a large scale back in the early to mid-70s when the subject was at its height. Now, whether or not this was true, there is some evidence that it was true, but they clearly weren't responsible for the entirety of the cattle mutilation phenomenon. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing, that, you know, there appears to be some sort of definitively unknown aspect to the phenomenon, you know, and whatever's causing this, but it seems like the Sons of Satan sort of jumped on the bandwagon, or may actually even have sort of used the real cattle mutilation phenomenon as a camouflage to allow them to perform their sort of ritualistic rites and so on cattle, and use the cattle mutilation, as I said, as a cover story. But they're a very mysterious group that vanished as quickly as they first surfaced, or were first exposed, I should say. But again, it demonstrates, you know, some of these weird, disturbing, satanic groups, you know, sort of traveling around the United States and, you know, performing all sorts of weird rituals and so on.
Well, piggybacking on cattle mutilation, like that's a couple of words that you don't think would come together. It's like, oh yeah, well, they're gonna be slaughtering and like taking the innards out of some cattle tonight. Guys, we can totally grab this blood for our satanic ritual. Hell yeah!
Well, I think, you know, in a strange way, that was part of it. You know, it was a case of they knew that the Sons of Satan knew that if they sort of just started large-scale killing on cattle, they might get tracked down. But what worked so well for them was that there was a real cattle mutilation phenomenon, and so they could, do what they were doing, and they knew that people would think, oh, it's some more of these cattle mutilations. So in other words, their activities would remain hidden in a very sort of strange way, really.
Well, Allison came up with this question. I'm looking through the outline right now, and I think this is a good one because for years, it's like the secret society of Skull and Bones. You got George Bush and John Kerry, both Skull and Bones, Obama, Harvard Law School, and all of these, the American aristocracy of the people that have been presidents have all been Masons, secret society members for centuries now. Now, the people that usually investigate this are guys like Alex Jones and InfoWars. But since Alex Jones and InfoWars are all in on Donald Trump, has there been any kind of, is he part of a secret society that we don't know about? Or has any secret societies seemed to, at Wharton or something like that, where he went to school, in your research?
I've got to be honest, I haven't personally come across anything, no. But, there's no doubt, though, that, when you talk about things like, Skull and Bones, there's no doubt that, some of the most powerful figures in the United States government and history, have been allied to Skull and Bones. It dates back to the 1830s, and from there it sort of grew, and powerful figures were recruited into this particular body, and to the point where it became, basically became like an order. To where you did have, like, for example, presidents, powerful and influential people in the banking industries, and also like think tank type groups, that sort of help develop, the economy and things like that. So in other words, Skull and Bones has been, like a major organization when it comes to sort of molding and, not so much creative, but more molding the United States, and its history and its goals and things like, and its interests,
In your research on the secret societies, have you found any of the, something more recent? Like when we think about secret societies, we think about ancient, we think of cults. We're talking about resurrecting a Babylonian goddess from millennia ago.
Yeah.
What have you found in maybe more recent secret societies that have kind of sprung up, especially in the age of the internet?
Well, actually, there's a perfect one I can think of that actually does relate to the internet, and I've got a number of really weird and also disturbing stories coming from various parts of the US of like an underground cult devoted to the Slender Man phenomenon. Now, the Slender Man there's no doubt was an internet creation. You can look it up and find the origins of it, but there is this theory which relates to what are known as tulpas or thought forms, that when enough people believe in something, in a strange way, it can give life to like a supernatural real life equivalent of something that existed just in fiction. So in other words, that the Slender Man has become a phenomenon of sort of on a massive scale, and to the point where there was a very sort of macabre story from a couple of years ago where a couple of girls, actually tried to murder their school friend in the name of the Slender Man. And, you can find made-up stories on the internet, and you can also find real stories of people who swore they saw the Slender Man. And as I said, it relates to this issue of when the human mind collectively on a massive scale, people start to believe in something, we can externalize it and actually create the phenomenon. It has some sort of, its own quasi-existence. And I've heard of a number of people who've supposedly in some kind of like an underground cult. When I say underground, I don't mean literally, I mean, clandestine cult that is trying to give more and more strength to this sort of mind-created Slender Man. And they sort of, have their rituals and rites to try and give it more power and substance, to where maybe there could be multiple Slender Men, creating these things all across the planet, which would be kind of very bizarre, but everything is bizarre about a lot of these cults, even just the rituals of some of the more down-to-earth ones, There's rarely a cult has existed that isn't a little bit strange in some way. So.
Well, I mean, just the fact that, who would try to create... You think about the different things that you could use with your brain. Why don't we try to create Indiana Jones? Why are we trying to create the Slender Man?
Right. That seems a little on the negative side.
Well, yeah. and that attempted murder, that happened in Allison in my backyard.
Yeah, not too far away. But, about 20, 30 minutes away from me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and about 10 minutes from where we grew up. And,
wow.
And so that particular, there are people in our Facebook who we know who are, affected by that. And you're just thinking, girls doing, not just girls, but people in general, adolescents do crazy things. But that particular thing and the idea that you could think that these fictional creatures are, could be brought into reality. And I remember your talk about thought forms was something that influenced me a lot when I read your 3 Men Seeking Monsters book.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. A drunken trip all around the UK, do you mean?
Yeah. And I took that book with me. So, Allison, you get it with me for Christmas, I think, one year.
I know. I'm the best sister ever.
You are the best sister ever. And then I took that book with me on a trip around the UK. And so we went to some of those similar locations. And
nice.
Probably didn't get as drunk, but we tried.
You set the bar high, Nick.
Yeah, I know. Well, when you grow up in England, that's what happens.
But that idea of the thought form is the first place.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole concept of thought forms is intriguing. It's basically, if you put a meme or an idea out there and people become fascinated by it and they think about it and it's on their mind and it's not just one person or 20 or 100, it's thousands, then the theory is that the human mind, the imagination, if you like, can create things that we can essentially externalize them. They can sort of stride out of our minds and have their own strange form of independent life. And they're obviously not physical creatures in the sense that we understand it. It's not like we're giving birth to them, but it's like we're projecting the imagery outwards. And the more that people believe in them, so the theory goes, is that they take on more and more of an independent existence and an intelligence and also like a sense of cunning and quite manipulative, and to where that they often turn on their creators. It's like a real life equivalent of Dr. Frankenstein and the monster. He unleashes this monster which proves to be his downfall. And that's kind of the same thing, is that the so-called tulpas, or thought forms as they're known, they turn on their creators inevitably. That's pretty much always the result that happens. And so, when you look at these cases and you find, the Slender Man, which does have a, I don't mean everybody who follows the Slender Man is in league with this cult. That's obviously not the case. But there are people who are big fans of the Slender Man phenomenon, and I'm sure, some of them sort of little paintings on the walls of, framed pictures of the Slender Man, and they read books about it. And when you've got thousands of people doing that, then you can understand how this thought form phenomenon could come into being. And then you have some people who, according to these rumors flying around now, that there have been in various parts of the US particularly cults created in the name of the Slender Man, and they're trying to perform rituals to bring him further and further into our world, and to essentially do its bidding. They want to be the Slender Man's minions or whatever.
Well, what I think is interesting there is the correlation between that and the New Nightmare movie that Wes Craven did in the 90s.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the whole idea, that because Freddy Krueger existed in the imaginations of people, that he started to bleed through into real life, into the creators of the fiction. And, you know, that whole idea that and Freddy Krueger's a character too. Like, you create this character that appears in people's nightmares, and then you watch the movie, and then you start having nightmares.
Mm-hmm. That's also one of the theories that's been put through for the Men in Black. That, you know, the idea that everybody, to some degree, kind of fears authority figures in like black suits and black fedoras and sunglasses knocking on your door and intimidating you. And then, you know, it's got the image of them, you know, is kind of, it's like unforgettable, you know. They're not like the movie versions, you know. The real ones are sort of pale and skinny and look like cadavers, you know, dressed in black suits. And it's just that image that gets in people's minds and imagination to where I think that at least some Men in Black reports might be tulpas, you know, the way the phenomenon's developed and been embraced by ufology to the point where maybe the Men in Black are, you know, because they act in such strange ways, it's almost like they're not fully self-aware of what they are. And, you know, that might be explainable if they are sort of, ironically, our own creations. And now it's like we can't put it back in the bottle, you know, it's now out and loose in society. So.
Well, and what is really strange about that for me, the whole Slender Man case is, so I'm an avid listener to Coast, as many of us are. And the night before the Slender Man stabbing on Friday, May 30th, 2014, Dave Schrader had a guest on, Bill Murphy from Sci-Fi's Fact or Faked. And they talked about such things. They talked about tulpas, just like we are now. And they particularly talked about the Slender Man and, you know, how he might be actually coming into existence because of people's beliefs and, you know, people's intentions to bring him forth or to focus on him. And then I just thought the very next day, I thought that was really strange that the very next day on the 31st is when the stabbing happened. Now, maybe the people who perpetrated the act, maybe those girls were listening, or maybe it's something else. But the coincidence there was just really startling to me.
No, that is. I mean, another classic example for the modern era as well would be the relatively recent surfacing of the so-called shadow people as well. You know, which in some respects they're not unlike the Men in Black, because there's like one subcategory of the shadow people known as the Hat Man, which is like a shadowy silhouetted form but wearing like a black suit and like a black fedora. So, you know, there's no doubt with the shadow people that has kind of not as big a following as the Slender Man, but certainly the shadow people is an area that a lot of people focus on and follow. And, you know, people wake up in the middle of the night and see this shadowy, one-dimensional, shadowy humanoid just looming over the bed or whatever. And that's, although you can find, you know, stories like sleep paralysis and things like that going back thousands of years, the silhouetted shadow person is a relatively new sort of aspect to it. So that, you know, there could be a tie in there as well.
Well, you know, it's funny about 20 years ago now, before the whole shadow person phenomenon happened, I was walking with some friends in a like a city, or not really a city park, but more like a county out in the middle of nowhere kind of place park, about, I'd say 10 miles from where that Slender Man stabbing occurred, actually. And we were walking down the path, and against a sign, it was a full moon that night, very bright, and against the sign, we saw the shadow of a person. And it was me and two other girls who saw it. And everybody saw it at the same time. It didn't reflect any light, or, I mean, you could read the sign except for the shadow of the person against the sign.
Oh, wow.
And it had this feeling like, and that may have just been the fear talking, but everybody had a feeling of dread. The girls saw it, I saw it, they freaked out and ran away. I saw it again for a second, I looked back, and then when I looked, there was nobody there. And we would have, if it was a person, you would have seen the features. You know, you would have seen like a nose or some kind. It would have reflected light, just like being under a lamp. And so when I started seeing on the internet a few years later, the fact that other people were seeing shadow figures and not related to a ghost, and I don't see things very normal. Like I've been on a million ghost tours. I've run a million ghost tours, and I never see anything. Let's just say, like sometimes, I'll feel like a weird grab on my arm, and I'm like, that's just my imagination. But to have an actual visual thing shared with a couple other people, and then to have other people in the world 4 or 5 years later to start talking about this and pick up on Coast to Coast, and you're like, holy crap! Like that, I might not be crazy.
That was really compelling to me too, because, like we were talking about before, Nick, when you have some knowledge of something before it becomes popular, or when you have some knowledge of something way back in history, before it was known to the modern era, there's something there when he was telling me the story, and then later on it became so popular, I'm like, hey, there could be something real there.
Right. My brother wasn't just tripping acid in the forest.
Not that time.
Well, and to move on from that, I think that you caused my wife and I to see a tulpa in the forest at the Blarney Castle in Ireland. Because we were reading your book, and we just got to the point I was telling my wife, and she's not into any of this stuff. Like, she thinks it's fun, and she'll put up with me. But we were, when we were traveling through the UK, and then I was reading your book, and then we dipped off to Ireland for a few days, and then we're in the forest, the park at the Blarney Castle, and we both saw a dark creature. I saw a dog. She saw a cat. And then I took a picture, and you just see a black shape of a cat, featureless in the distance. But she was considering leaving her career and going into veterinary, and she was offered a job at this cat care clinic. And so she was looking for a sign of what she should do with her life. And we both saw something, and this is another thing where it's like, okay, we were together, we saw something, and I'm like, well, it's probably just a dog, and she's like, I saw a cat, and I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, it's totally not a cat. And then I took a look at the picture, and there's a just black shape of a cat, 100 yards away or whatever, and I'm like, oh my God, did I read this book, tell you about it, and then we go have a tulpa experience, 2 days later.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, maybe that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
So, Nick, one last question for you, I think. And I could, like, the way you tell stories, we could probably just say, press a button and go, and just listen to your stuff all day.
Yeah. I'd just stay here all day if I could.
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to save some more, especially because you have such a prolific printing schedule. We always know that it's like, let's bring Nick on to talk about his new book.
That's right. Just let a couple months go by and he'll be back on again. Because you have one coming out on shapeshifting soon, don't you?
Yeah, that comes out in September, but typically with the publishing industry, it might actually start to appear in the shops in August. But it's, obviously the most famous shapeshifter of all is like the werewolf. And there are like 3 or 4 chapters on werewolves in the book. But what I've done also is to show people that, contrary to popular opinion or popular belief, there are multiple different types of shapeshifters. Like they've got a chapter in there on werecats, where people have seen like people turn into almost like something that's half cat, like a bipedal cat-like animal.
A real cat.
And also how, like a lot of ancient, like Babylonian supernatural entities could take on different forms as well. And also talk about like clinical lycanthropy, where people in their mind believe they're changing into different animals. So it covers, and also things like witches' familiars, in the Middle Ages in the UK, where witches would have these familiars, as they were called, these demonic creatures that could turn into like bats or cats, and so
or that cute little Vinegar Tom that I want.
Yeah, exactly.
Google, he's so cute. That's why he's irresistible.
So this shapeshifters, actually goes far beyond just the Hollywood image of somebody bursting out their clothes, at the full moon or whatever.
Well, we can't wait to have you back on and talk about that. And there's just so many other topics that I think would be really incredible to talk to you about.
Oh, the one last thing I wanted to get from you, Nick, was in your 365 days of UFOs, in the full year of UFOs, you had to pick a story on your birthday. And you know that when it's going to be your birthday, it's probably you're going to probably have several different stories. You know what I mean? And you'll be like, this is the best one, and I got to make it good because it's my birthday. So I was wondering, what was the UFO story associated with your birthday? Because I thought that'd probably be the best one.
Okay, well, my birthday's November 24, and ironically, it's actually not that impressive, really. It's a study of an Air Force documentation that talks about how the military, well, I guess it is interesting, how the military was dealing with the media on the UFO subject, and, sort of the Air Force's concerns that they were going to be, treated fairly and not be sort of accused of covering things up. So, it's sort of an interesting, it wasn't so much a UFO case, but it's interesting in terms of how the military had concerns that, well, what's the media going to say to us, and how should we deal with the media if they ask us questions about UFOs, with it being sort of like a controversial area. So, that particularly sort of demonstrates how, the government perceives the media, and probably ufology as well, in terms of what they should say or not say, and concerns about, being misquoted, or, people getting a distorted view if it's a sensational story. So, it does give like some intriguing insight into what goes on behind the scenes.
Awesome. Well, Nick, where can people find you? Do you have a website or anything in particular if people are looking to get more information on Nick Redfern and his prolific paranormal authorship?
Yeah, sure. Well, I have a blog which I update most days, and it's called World of Whatever, and the address is Nick Redfern 14, Fortean, Nick Redfern 14.blogspot.com. People can reach me at Twitter, Nick Redfern UFO, or you can also find me on Facebook as well. There are actually a few Nick Redferns on Facebook, but scroll down and see the guy in the black leather jacket, the bandana, standing in front of an old black car, and that's me. And people can get the books. All my books are available on Amazon, and about 60% of them you can buy off the shelves in Barnes & Noble as well. So.
And we're going to have links to all of that stuff in the show notes. That's othersidepodcast.com/137. And that's where you're going to be able to find links to anything by Nick Redfern. And you're going to be able to learn more, pick up the books, because you're going to want to read them. Alice and I have read a bunch of them and love them.
And he's fascinating.
Yeah. And Nick, we talked to you all day.
Oh, well, thanks, guys.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Nick.
Thank you.
I had a good time. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Right on. Allison from Milwaukee Ghost, thank you for joining us again, too.
My pleasure.
Whew, wow, you guys really covered the gamut of paranormal topics there. I got to say, that was really fun to listen to.
Yeah, well, I think the thing about Nick that's great is that whatever topic you bring up, he's got some kind of story that he can throw out.
Something really good, too.
Yeah. And, it's funny that at the end of the interview, I said to Nick, we were reading your book, 3 Men Seeking Monsters, when my wife and I were traveling through Ireland, and then we saw a tulpa, the Tibetan thought form, where we saw 2 different things. And I was mentioning this to Chris on Saturday. Oh, we interviewed this guy, and she's like, well, it was because we saw that weird thing that I decided to get a job at the cat care clinic, and it's because I hated the job at the cat care clinic that I decided to go to law school. So she goes, did you tell him that he's responsible for changing my life?
And indeed you did.
I'm like, well, not in those words. And I just thought it was a funny thing, because she's like, yeah, your weirdo stuff is great.
It's like the butterfly wings that set off the tsunami on the other side of the planet, right?
And I just thought it was a funny thing. I was like, yeah, I guess that guy is kind of responsible. So we're going to have Nick on again next time he has a book. And next time we go to Dallas, the Big D, we're going to hunt him down and find him in his home. Because we missed him at the Paradigm Symposium because he couldn't make it this year. He had like a house emergency.
Yeah. And
so we missed him at the Paradigm Symposium. So we're going to have to buy him a pint.
Yeah, definitely.
As our English friends say, across the pond. We're going to have to buy him a pint and have a good time with Nick Redfern. And what I thought was the most interesting thing about the interview?
What's that?
Well, the fact that, and this is completely unexpected. When I said, what's the most surprising thing you think you learned about the paranormal? And he's like, probably the Chupacabra. That the Chupacabra's real. And I'm like, what? The Chupacabra? Like, that's the last thing I'd expect somebody to say.
No, that's awesome. And anytime anybody references El Chupacabra, it always excites me.
It does. And we'll put a link to the show notes about our episode on El Chupacabra. We love that mythical beast so much that we wrote a song about him and recorded it, and we even named one of our EPs El Chupacabra. And there's a Spanish language version as well. So we're going to link to everything. You'll be able to find that. othersidepodcast.com/137. I can't say 137 in Spanish, otherwise I would. I should have watched more Sesame Street. So the thing is, I was completely baffled that he would say that. And then he goes into why he thinks that the Chupacabra's got way more evidence than most of us go into. So thought for the song this week, since the Chupacabra is a beast. So Wendy, do you remember when we decided to do an exercise as a band and all write a song about the scorpion and the parable of the scorpion and the frog?
I remember that, yes.
Yes. So we came up with a song that, well, it's a heavy rocker that does emphasize the beastly part of it. And so if you guys are familiar with the tale of the scorpion and the frog, well, it's about how you can't escape your nature. And that's what this song's called, The Nature of the Beast.
I'm loving, caring, and kind. You'll put your stinger in my backside. Your venom I can't resist. So let's get on with this. You love me, you hate me. You try, but you can't change me. I'm a victim, I'm a killer. I can help it, that's my nature. My nature. I'm nice, but I'm not a fool. You're designed to be cruel. You can't help your insatiable flaws. I get it, my misguided trust. You love me, you hate me. Try, but you can't change me. I'm a victim, I'm a killer. I can help it, that's my nature. You can't deny what you can't control. The beast is cold or hot, but you're slow. There's no changing spots through an exit road. So let's take a dive in the swimming hole. You love me, you hate me. You can try, but you can't change me. I'm a victim, I'm a killer. I can help it, that's my nature. You love me, you hate me. You love me, you hate me, and that's my nature. My nature. My nature. My nature.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
We're not done yet, though.
Of course not, because we haven't thanked our awesome Patreon community.
Yes. Love our Patreons, and we want to give a special shout out to Ned, who's pledged us at a level where he gets his own special shout out every single episode. Ned, we love you.
Thank you, Doc.
And we love all of you Patreons. And if you want to join the community, how can they do that, Mike?
You probably should just wander over to othersidepodcast.com/donate. Now you're going to have to wander with your fingers on a cell phone because you can't just walk in.
Right.
But othersidepodcast.com/donate is a way you can find to be part of the special community that helps create more and more episodes of See You on the Other Side songs, podcast videos, and fun stuff. And we would love to give you a big hug right there. And then all of a sudden, the pants wedding begins all at once.